How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Virtual History 360. I'm Mr. Wade, and this is my live stream review before your More Perfect Union exam. Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope you're having a good night. I appreciate you taking the time to come spend with me to help you review. So again, this is about you, not me. I'm here to help you. So look at that chat bar. Ask questions, ask away, because the more questions you ask, the more questions I can answer, the better prepared you're going to be for the test. So, a couple of ground rules: keep it civil, keep it on task, and remember there's a delay from when I ask something to when you hear it, to when you type it, to when I can answer. So bear with me as we get through all this, okay? Let's see what we got. It looks like I forgot my notebook, so I'll have to use scrap paper or keeping track of everything. I see Lulu. Is that Luhan, maybe? Let's see. And then I see Jayla. Is that my Jayla, I'm guessing? Get some of the early names out of the way. And let's see, Danya Garcia. It's Angelina. Angelina, I hope your mom's doing better. Hope to hear good news from you. Thank you for joining. I appreciate you taking your time. I know things are tough right now, but you got this, okay? Alright, let's see how we're doing. I'm going to click over here. Only got a handful of people in, but I know personally I messed up. I forgot to hit the go live until 7:29. I normally do go live at 7:25. So it's probably going to take a couple minutes for people to get the notification, because I know YouTube likes to mess that up. Did I ever tell you the story? I did a live stream once. I forget what it was, but I think it was my Civil War 100 countdown. And it was a Monday. I did a live stream at 7 p.m., right? Tuesday, I went out to dinner with Mrs. Ng and her husband and her family, and while we're sitting at the restaurant, her phone buzzed, and it was a notification that I went live. Exactly 24 hours after the stream. Now, was that a very good notification? I don't think so. Because how is she going to be able to watch the live stream if she doesn't get the notification until a day later? So, Angelina, I just saw your chat. That's awesome to hear. I'm very happy. But yeah, so YouTube likes to mess with that. So I'm going to pause for a few minutes and just kind of chat with you guys. How's your night going? How are you guys doing? Jayla, Luhan, I see Angelina's doing better, so that's good. But Luhan, Jayla, how are you guys doing tonight? Let's see. While I'm waiting for that, because I know there's a delay, had an idea. There's a YouTube channel called The Curious World. Let me verify that I have in my things, because I actually subscribe to this girl because she's incredible and I think she's a good YouTuber. Oh, where is it? It disappeared. Did I unsubscribe? Oh, there it is. The Curious World, yeah. Ooh, we got hives. Oh, goodness. Take some Benadryl. I'm not a doctor, so don't listen to my doctor advice. Yeah, The Curious World. I'll bring up. She did a video visiting a tour of a mustard museum. I'll tell you what. Let's see. Let me put it in the chat. Curious World Mustard Museum. It's not the link, I know, but if you look up the chat, or look up what I put in the chat, Curious World Mustard Museum, you'll see it. I really, it caught me as like a YouTuber. way she did the editing and told the story, I thought I did really good. And I kind of want to maybe model maybe do videos kind of like that. So aside from studying for a test, if you get a chance, watch that video and let me know what you think about that, because it's something that just intrigued me just a little. Okay. So it is 7:35. We're about 5 minutes in. Looks like 6 minutes since I hit. So yeah, we're about 5 minutes after 7:30. Let's see. Should we get started? All right. So more perfect union. Okay. Our power standard is A310, which is examine the cause, course, and consequence of the Constitutional Convention. So okay, you're used to it now. Okay. Good. As long as you can manage, that's what really matters, right? Okay. So Constitution. More perfect union, all this good stuff. So the idea is we fought the revolution, we won our independence, and we have our own country to run our own government, right? Well, we started with the Articles of Confederation that held us together during the war because we had a common enemy, okay? But as soon as we didn't have that common enemy, the cracks started to show. The flaws were apparent, and we started to come apart. The big event that we talked about was Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, and about 1,500 Massachusetts farmers didn't like the idea that they were being foreclosed on because they weren't getting their payments from Congress for their pensions. So the banks, wanting to collect their debt, were foreclosing farms. So they raided the armory and the arsenal in Springfield and marched on Boston, and kind of raised havoc throughout Massachusetts. Yeah, the national government couldn't help that, couldn't stop that. Now, Daniel Shays obviously was arrested but was let go. He ended up dying, I think it was in upstate New York, I looked it up. But that was one example of why or how the government just couldn't, hold the country together. All right? So, we talked about the weaknesses of the articles, and then that leads into the Constitutional Convention, which is obviously a huge to do because you have all these states trying to argue and debate and get something good for them, right? Everyone was out for their own, so we have a lot of compromises that came out of that. And then we get into our level 3, which is the just the structure of government that we have, the idea of federalism that came out of that, right? So does that make sense? So that's what we got going on. That's our unit that we're in. Again, kind of stalling for time just because I know I started the stream a few minutes later than I normally would. Almost 7:30 instead of 7:25. Hopefully people are getting the notifications. We're up to, I think, 5 or 6 people right now. So give them a few minutes. Hopefully we get up to that. Man, remember that first stream we did this year, guys? We had, 20 people in here? That was incredible. Loved having that many people. So, all right. So first question. Angelina, you're jumping in. What were the weaknesses? Now, I told you there were 4 weaknesses that we really need to key in on, right? They couldn't tax. It's hard to run a country without money, right? Running a country is expensive. So, what are you going to do? You can't tax. You can only ask to borrow money. Government asks you for money. What are you going to say? You're going to say no. States are not required to pay the money. So, what do? They say no. Okay? That's one of the big ones. Then you had the idea of couldn't regulate foreign trade or dealing with foreign relations. Imagine, and I use modern example, we live in Florida, right? Imagine Florida making a deal with England to trade with England, right? And then Georgia trying to make a deal with England but doesn't get as good of a deal or gets a better deal. And then Florida's like, how did you get a better deal? And then all of a sudden, things aren't so good. It wasn't a uniform deal. They were dealing with 13 independent countries rather than one country with 13 states. That wasn't a good combination, right? And then we talked about how they couldn't enforce because there was no enforcement branch. There was no executive branch. That's foreshadowing what we're going to get into when we get to the structure of government. And then the idea that it was impossible to change. Now, to pass a law, it was 9 out of 13, but we're not going to stress about that. We're talking about changing the articles. To amend the articles to fix these problems, you need all 13, unanimous, 13 out of 13 states to vote yes, to have a change to fix these big problems. Okay? So those are the 4 big weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. There are others that we talked about, but those are the four big ones that we harped in on. Okay. Let's see, Luan, what's an example of bicameral? Well, what's a bicycle? Bicycle means it's a vehicle with two wheels, right? So bicycle, two, bicameral, two house, two chamber. An example, our Congress. It's bicameral. You have the House of Representatives, you have the Senate, okay? Two chambers in the legislative branch, okay? Darkfire, that's Clark, right? I think I recognize your name, I believe. Was there a debate on if slavery was still going to be a thing? Ooh, that's a big question. The answer in context here, yes and no. That kind of debate kind of goes back really far, for our country about really regarding to, declaring independence and the idea of abolition going through. We talked about what was the quote? I'm drawing a blank. Oh, Roger Sherman. Duh, couldn't think of his name. Roger Sherman saying abolition's already started in some states, so they were of the opinion that if they were a slaveholding state, it was going to keep going. If they were a state that's already abolished slavery, it was going to abolish. So was there a real debate on if slavery was still going to be a thing, meaning an institution? Not really. It was really came down to the severity of it, if that makes sense. We talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise and how much they were going to let the slave-holding states dictate the way the Constitutional Convention would go, or the Slave Trade Compromise, where commerce was going to be regulated by Congress, but they couldn't mess with this one thing. So it was really a matter of degree of how much slavery was going to impact rather than was there going to be slavery. I hope that answers the question, okay? Let's see. Alana. There you are. Let me write down your name. What information should we absolutely have memorized? For sure, we need to know for times. Oh, I hate the way you phrase that question. I appreciate your question. I'm going to answer it, but I hate the way you phrase it because I don't want you to just memorize things. I want you to understand things. There's a difference. There's like a line. Memorizing things means it's easy to forget things, right? Okay, so the idea is I don't want you to just memorize all this little bits. I want you to understand how this is playing into and then use this information as we go through the years or through the rest of the school year, because what we're doing is building on the story of America, okay? I don't want you to just remember, first president was George Washington. Yeah, that's not what's so important. It's the lessons that we learn from what's going on, okay? So I want you to take away these lessons, okay? So with that being said, there are certain things that I want you to know because I do have to hit the standards. Okay, so I hate the way you phrased it, but I get it. I understand it. But I'm going to kind of answer that question as we go through because there's a lot to this story. Okay. Which out of the three compromises do you think is the least important? Ooh. Man, you guys are hitting me with some hard questions early. Oh, these questions usually came like at the half-hour mark last time. Let's see. Which compromise do I think was the least important? That's a good one. I like that question. Only because you're making me think, and I like that because I came in here just to lecture, but you guys are throwing it on me. That's a really hard one. I would argue, and this is probably because they're all important. So on a scale of importance, you have 0 to 100. We're talking the top 96%. The top 4. I would say the Great Compromise was the least important because at the end of the day, representation is representation. As long as they have, representation on, I think the bicameral, answer was good, part of the plans, but I would say that was the least important because they could have compromised several different ways and we would still have a very similar system that we have now. Electoral College, I think, was a big deal because it really, again, getting back to the story of America, I think it's really shifted the trajectory of America. I think the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Slave Trade Compromise, I think the Commerce Compromise, I think that, and then kind of what I mentioned with Jayla's question about slavery, was the idea of, how much power these slaveholding states were going to have in forming this new government. So I think that really veered the trajectory. The Great Compromise, at the end of the day, I think in time we would still end up kind of where we are, whether we had proportional representation, if we had equal representation. I think it kind of went all the way around. And I'm going to pause what I said to answer Alana's question, just to say, Esfandi, how are you doing, my friend? You never answered my question. I replied to your comment on my other video. And what school are you at now? Are you back in Osceola County? Are you back at your home? Where you traveled? I don't know. I'm here. You're a former student. I miss you. I hope you're doing well. I wish I still had you this year. All right. Now to Alana. Do we need to know dates or names? Well, you should have an idea who Daniel Shays is because we mentioned Shays Rebellion. Dates, the big date is the Commerce Compromise, the Slave Trade Compromise, where they waited until 1808 before they could mess with or ban the slave trade. Let's see. I mean, we talked about Roger Sherman being the great compromiser, right? But really? No, that's about it. There's some names you should know. Let's see. We talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? Think back to the Mr. Haber song, Hamilton, Madison, Jay on the one side, Patrick, Henry, and his crew on the other. So those names are kind of a big deal. James Madison, he's the father of the Constitution, because it was his notes, it was his kind of structure that they went with for the Constitution. He was the main writer. He was obviously a Federalist that supported the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton was another Federalist that supported the Constitution. So those are names you should know. But there were, Patrick Henry being the biggest anti-Federalist. So those are names you should know. Dates, 1787, kind of went over this on Constitution Day, so I didn't really put it into this unit. 1787, September 17th. It's kind of a big deal, but it wasn't fully ratified until later. But, names and dates don't matter. It's the story that matters, okay? I only give you names to kind of give you context. And that's really the whole point, okay? Let's see. Still confused of delegated, implied, reserved, and concurrent powers. Can you explain it again? Okay. So, basically, delegated, enumerated, expressed. Delegated, enumerated, expressed. All mean the same thing. Those are powers that are listed in the Constitution. The federal government can do this, this, and this. Delegated powers. Coin money. Foreign affairs. Raise an army. Those are big things, right? Those are listed out, right? Implied powers. Those fall under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Necessary and proper, okay? They listed out all the big things, but they obviously couldn't think of everything. So they have the power to do or create laws that are necessary and proper to do their other jobs. Okay? Remember we gave the example of the interstate system. There's nowhere in the Constitution does it expressly say that Congress can fund a road. But Congress does have the power to regulate interstate commerce, interstate trade. So necessary and proper to regulate the trade, they could build a road. Okay, that's what implied powers are, necessary and proper. Okay, and then let's see, you went to reserve. Powers reserved to the states. Okay, elections, regulating businesses and licensing, schools. Those are powers that are reserved. That's the 10th Amendment, reserved for the states. Concurrent powers. Concurrent means to share with, right? With each other. Concurrent, shared. Taxation. That's the big one, right? Federal taxes, state taxes, local taxes. Every level of government wants a piece of that pie. So those are shared powers. All right? So delegated, implied, reserved, and concurrent powers are shared powers. Okay? Let's see. Which of the three compromises impacted on how things are now? Ooh, man, good question. Let's see. It looks like you just retracted that quote or that question, but I'm still going to answer it because in our modern world, again, I'll stand by my statement and just my opinion that I think the Great Compromise could have played out a couple different ways. So I don't think that one's impacting. We fought a war and got the 13th Amendment, so I'm not terribly, saying that the see, it's hard to answer because I'm a Civil War historian. I really connect everything to that. I would say that maybe we could argue that the Slave Trade Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise both impacted us today because it led to the Civil War, which led to disunion, which led to, a bunch of other stuff. You could argue the Electoral College had the biggest impact today, where we are today, because of the way presidents are elected, which is our leader, which is the person who's directing our country. I'm not going to answer that question. Those are my opinions, and I'm going to stop it there. Okay? As Fondy's at a new school moved to. We miss you too, bud. But I appreciate you coming in and hanging out with me. And hopefully, whatever class you're in, this is helping you as well. Okay? Let's see. Luan, what was the main reason why people were against federalism? You're thinking like anti-federalism. They weren't so much against federalism. They were against the idea of giving power away. Okay, so it's not the idea of shared power, because you could argue that the Articles of Confederation was a form of federalism, but the idea of giving more power to the central government and not putting a check on it. So the biggest anti-federalist argument was taking power away from the states. Okay, if you take power away from the states, the government becomes too powerful. The government can then take your freedoms away. So that's what the anti-federalists argued. Okay, so the main reason people were anti-federalists or against the Constitution was they were afraid they gave the central government too much power. Okay, you have to remember the clause in the article. Not like you don't need to remember Section 1, Clause 18, or Section 8, Clause 18. You don't need to remember that. No, just know what necessary and proper mean. Okay. If you could add any amendment when the more perfect union was happening, what would it be? Okay, so here's the problem. If you look up the original Bill of Rights, there were 12, and then they will, well, a lot more than that. The first draft, or the second to last draft was 12, and then they whittled it down to 10, kind of lumped the reserve and the 9th and 10th together. See, your qualifier there is not add any amendment, so that doesn't mean today. You said when the Constitutional Convention was going on. What would I add? Man, you guys are on point today with these questions. I like that. What amendment would I have added back in 1787? Or we'll round up to 1791. I don't know. You could answer that question a couple different ways. You could answer it as, hindsight. What amendment have we that came later that they should have added right away? I would say you could argue the 18th Amendment of, people directly, or citizens electing their senators. Maybe that, I don't know. Or something that we don't have yet. I don't know. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a proponent of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. That would have encompassed the Civil Rights Amendment, or Civil Rights Movement, and maybe we should have put that in right away. I think that's the best answer, but not in the context of that time, because they didn't feel that way. See, that's the beauty of history, is because you have to reconcile what you know, and knowing what we know now to what they knew then. And you could argue that people knew that they weren't perfect, and that's why the idea is we're creating a more perfect union, not a perfect union. Man, I love these questions. These are really good. Oh my goodness. I'll come back to that. Ask me again if we have time. Oh, this might be a long stream because I'm enjoying this. You guys are doing really good. Let's see. Where are we? Can you explain the slave trade compromise? Slave trade compromise, otherwise known as the Commerce Compromise, was the idea that Congress was going to have the power, listed, enumerated, expressed power to regulate commerce, trade, business. Okay? Well, southern states said, well, trading slaves and importing slaves is big business for us. We make a lot of money off of this. And if Congress has the power to regulate this, they might do away with it because, northern states are anti-slavery. So the slave trade compromise was that they were willing to pay taxes on the slaves that were imported as long as Congress promised not to ban the slave trade. So they agreed for 20 years effectively, because starting January 1st, 1808, they would not be able to ban the slave trade. Now, that didn't ban slavery, but the slave trade, because again, power to regulate commerce. So the slave trade was a deal, a compromise, where they said as long as you pay taxes, we won't ban slave trade until 1808, which they did. But by 1809 it was done. Okay, not slavery, not the slave interstate trade, but the importation of slaves. So that was ones that they, kind of put it off for about 20 years, but that was it. Hopefully that answered that. I was finally asked, why was FDR had 3 terms as president? Also, what is the Great Depression, and what does it mean? Okay. I'm going to give you the 4-second answer. It's fine because I don't want to go too off topic. FDR was the only 3-term president. He wasn't the only one to think about it. He was actually won 4 terms, but he died before the 4th term got going. So he was the only 3-term because everyone either followed the precedent of Washington that we'll talk about in our Federalist unit, next unit, or no one was good enough to run for a 3rd time. That's why. The Great Depression was speculators, ran the banking system ragged, and when the market crashed, they lost their money, and then the banks had to pay out money, but banks don't keep everything on hand, so they needed a bank holiday, and then it just spiraled out of control, and it took time to get out of it. So that's my 4-second answer of your question. Back to more perfect union. Okay. Which amendment do you think was the most important at that time? So referring to the amendments in the Bill of Rights, all, you have the First Amendment, the 5 freedoms, those liberties of the individual. Second, Third Amendment dealing with more military-based, well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms, or no quartering of troops. And then you have the protections from the enforcement branch. This is found in 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. No search and seizure without warrant, due process, meaning everyone gets the same treatment under law, no self-incrimination or double jeopardy, right to a speedy trial. Those are all protecting you from the enforcement branch. So, at that time, 4, 5, and 6 would probably be the biggest answer. 7 deals with civil. 8, no cruel and unusual punishment. I always like to say no cruel and unusual. So you can have cruel punishment. You can argue the death penalty is cruel. Unusual punishment, like make you wear a feather duster on your hands and make you dust the shelves in school, on top of the lockers. That's unusual, right? But it's not cruel. But if it's cruel and unusual, then it's goes against the 8th Amendment. Okay? Excessive bail, kind of a big deal, right? So I guess 8th also falls into the protecting from the enforcement branch, because again, we never had that executive branch before. So by adding that 8th Amendment and all those other 4, 5, 6, and 8, it kind of keeps the executive branch from going too far. So I would argue that those are the most important at that time. Okay, this is similar to the 3rd level, but why did the national government give the states power? Because the states wouldn't have agreed to give them any power if they didn't give them some. That's the best answer I can give to that. Because the idea of people needed local control to justify what the government was able to do, and if everything is centered in New York or Philadelphia or eventually Washington, you couldn't have local response. Today it's a little easier. We have the internet. I can tweet out something and my representative can see it in Washington. I can call their office. They didn't have phones back then. They didn't have email. They didn't have Twitter. So the local governments control the day-to-day lives. Still control our day-to-day lives. We talked about that. 95% of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis is local and state government control. Okay? National government gets the headlines, but really, if you want to get involved in your day-to-day operations, deal with the local and state governments. Okay? Who is, or who do you think is the most important person related to the more perfect union? Ooh. For this unit, if you're really stuck on people, I would say James Madison, the father of the Constitution, wrote the Bill of Rights, Federalist, kind of came together. So I would argue James Madison's the biggest name. Okay. What were the differences between the Senate and the House of Representatives, and how would they work together? Okay. All right, Clark, I got you on this one. The difference is in how representation is determined. The Senate is based on equal representation. No matter how big your state is, how large your population is, you get the same number of senators. Everyone gets 2. The House of Representatives, on the opposite side, is based on population. The more people you have, the more representatives you get. Okay? Originally, it was 1 representative for every 30,000 citizens, but today it's capped at 435 just because they have a small room. So you can get 1, or you can get 53. That's pretty much how it is, but it's proportional to how big your state is. Florida, I think we're going up to 28, if I remember correctly, after the last census. So the more people that live in your state, the more representatives you get. Okay? How will they work together? Well, if it's bicameral, meaning both houses of Congress have to agree. So if the House of Representatives passes a bill, the Senate has to pass that same bill. If the Senate makes changes, you're going to learn more about this in civics, but if the Senate makes changes, it has to go back to the House, and they have to both pass the same bill. Once it's passed both houses of Congress, then it goes to the president to be signed into a law or vetoed. That's how they work together. What the Federalists call is the party went away after the War of 1812. Pretty much nothing. They kind of transferred into the Whigs, but that was a separate party. But you're getting ahead of our timeline, Miss Fondy. Oh, let's see. Angelino, was there any non-problematic states, or did they all want their own thing? They kind of clumped together, if that makes sense. I mean, they all wanted their own thing, but regions kind of grouped together because being in similar regions, they would have similar things that they needed, right? So, these are great questions. I'm going to pause answering those questions because I just realized we've been going at this for about a half hour. Actually, I'm going to answer this one question because it popped up right before I was about to get started. What should I do ninth grade? If you're, Angelina, are you in sixth grade right now? If you're in sixth grade right now, that means you'll take civics in seventh grade and you'll do world history, high school world history in eighth grade. That answers your question. Okay. Let's kind of like double back a little bit. Look, okay, let's bring it back just a little bit. We have the Articles of Confederation. A couple things I want to talk about. I want to make sure we're on the same page because we're, like I said, we're a half hour in. I want to make sure we're doing good. All right. Remember, in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed to get all 13 states to agree. It's impossible to do that. Virtually impossible. Virtually impossible to get 13 states to agree to a change to the Articles. Okay. But it didn't have the power to do things. It couldn't enforce laws. It couldn't tax. So without having these powers, they couldn't do anything. And if it couldn't do those things and you couldn't fix those, that's just a bad thing, right? But remember, you put it into context. Again, we could list the weaknesses, but put it into context. We just fought a war to do away with a tyrant king, the tyrant King George III, right? So why would we replace a tyrannical English monarchy with our own tyrannical government, right? So our government was purposefully set up to be weak because if we wanted, there was no point to the war if we were just going to replace bad with bad, right? We just, unfortunately, the pendulum swung too far. So we set up the government to be weak because of what we just came from, right? But remember, these weaknesses began to show after the war, right? Having a common enemy, that king that we just talked about, held us together. And, if you saw my video, the straw that broke the camel's back was Shays of Gun because it showed the whole country how weak the national government was, and it called people to reform the Articles, or in the end replace it with a stronger central government. Okay, so remember, that's where we're coming from. Okay, so they replace it with a stronger central government, and the idea is they're going to add an executive branch, they're going to add a judicial branch to the legislative branch that the Articles had. And remember the Montesquieu song, with checks and balance, right? Each branch kept the other from becoming too powerful. This was one of the arguments the Federalists had, was that the three branches would keep the government from becoming too powerful with checks and balances. Okay? Question is, Pop, what are the most important things we have to understand that are on the test? What I'm saying now. Okay? So go back 2 minutes when you replay this at the 32-minute mark. To now, okay? These are the most important things. I know we need to wrap this up because it's after 8 o'clock. It's my bedtime, okay? So, the idea is these states all came together to revise the Articles, which turned into replacing, and they argued and they compromised, okay? The big compromise, the great compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. You had the New Jersey plan that called for representation based on equality. Every state, small states liked this because every state got the same amount. Then you had the large states, like the Virginia plan, that called for every state being represented based on population. Large states loved this because they would have more power in government, right? So the idea of representation was debated. The slave trade was debated. The electoral vote or the Electoral College was debated. The Three-Fifths Compromise was debated because Southern states said if we count our slaves toward representation, we'll have more votes in government, right? So, you know, obviously states that had already abolished slavery wanted to count slaves as zero towards representation because they argued the Southern states don't count them as citizens, don't count them as humans. Why would they be allowed to count them as, population for representation? Southern states said we should count them all because we want more power. So they compromised with 3/5, right? And it's just simple math. 60%. They would count 60% of the enslaved population, or as the Constitution put it, other persons, because they didn't put the word slave in the Constitution, right? So they counted it 60%. So instead of 100 or 0, they kind of met in the middle. Not 50-50, but 60% counted towards representation. Oh, I mentioned the Electoral College. I know this is confusing, so you don't need to become an expert in the Electoral College, but just know that when you're 18, or me, when I go vote for president, I vote, and that popular vote, the people's vote, determines who wins the state. And then the state pledges their electors, which is based on representation, to actually cast official ballots for the president. Okay, so it's the Electoral College that elects the president. You need to know this because that's going to come into fruition later, like when we get to Jefferson. Okay. But again, it was, they're giving more power to the federal government, but they still kept power in the states. The idea of shared power, or federalism. Okay. Power is shared between the states because the states could respond at the local level, but the national government or central government was getting more power so that they could run the country. Okay? Let's see. When I talk about running the country, money is what, really everything kind of revolves around here, and commerce was the big deal. And I know you asked about the commerce compromise earlier, the slave trade compromise earlier. The idea was they wouldn't mess with the slave trade until 1808 because they were able to compromise, saying we won't mess with the slave trade as long as we can tax the slaves, but we won't mess with it for 20 years as long as you let us regulate the rest of the commerce. Okay, so that's one of the big powers, was commerce, money, dealing with business and trade. Okay, but even still, all right, we'll get to these questions in a second. I'm seeing the chat go crazy right here, but I'm going to come back to that. But even still, adding these powers, there were still people that were for and against it. You had the Federalists, you had James Madison. He wrote the Constitution. And of course, he's like, checks and balances and all the enlisted powers are going to protect you, right? But the people need this, okay? The government needs to be able to control. Shays' Rebellion showed we need the government, right? Anti-Federalists said states need to have more power. Anti-Federalists favored that strong state government. Federalists argued for a stronger central government. Then they met in the middle with the Bill of Rights to protect our rights. Excuse me. And we talked about the Federalist Papers. Remember, they were only written to be published in New York, but they got spread everywhere in all the conventions because they laid out why the Constitution was good. But unfortunately, they needed the Bill of Rights. And in hindsight, it's a really good thing they did that because the government did stretch its powers, right? So the Federalist Papers, Federalists argued for the Constitution. Anti-Federalists said that they needed a Bill of Rights and they should take slavery out. Okay? All right. So that was a 7-minute quick review. Let me go through the questions, and I'm going to say this before I go through these questions. We're going to wrap this up in the next few minutes, okay? So if you have any other questions, this is your last call. And now let me start answering these questions here. Let's see. You can get 6th and 7th. Oh, it's luck of the draw, I guess. Talk to your counselors. What are the most important things we have to... I already answered that because that was my 7-minute, quick synopsis of the unit going all the way from level 1 to level 3. Which plan did you agree with the most? The Connecticut Compromise, I guess. I don't know. And let's see, it's funny. Oh, I should show this because... Yeah, I think it's fair to show this. It's not PC by any means, but I think it's fair. Why weren't women actually not allowed to vote? Is it because they were women or they were weak? It was, a misogynistic, male-run world back then, and it wasn't about equality. They argued, a shadow equality that women control their husbands and their sons, but that's not really controlling yourself. So it was just they wanted to consolidate power with men. That's why. Okay? So I've covered every question in the chat. You guys were great. You guys asked some really good questions tonight. I really appreciate it. But we are 40 minutes in, so I think we can call it. I think we can go back, and if you want, rewatch this again, starting at the 32-minute mark. I think it would be very helpful for you. But let's end it here. Again, I'm going to wait about 30 more seconds just because I know there's a delay. So if you do have a question, get it in. Otherwise, I think you guys are ready. I appreciate you guys giving up, 40 odd minutes on your Monday evening to review and study. Well, let's see. I think it's safe to say you guys are going to be prepared. I've gone through everything that you need to know. I've answered questions that aren't even on the test. Thanks, Asfandi. But yeah, I think we can call it a day. Thank you, Luhan, Jayla, Angelina, Clark, Alana, Asfandi. I think I got everyone written down. But it's been about 30 seconds. No new questions have popped up, so I'm going to say good night. I'm going to say get your rest, eat your breakfast in the morning, and come to school tomorrow ready to take this test. If you want, rewatch this video before the class. Might help you. All right. So, again, from at least the 32-minute mark. All right, so good night, everyone. Get your rest, and I'll see you tomorrow. See you guys next time. Bye, everyone.